Okay, I don't want to keep you guys waiting too long. I guess we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ashok Mohanraj, and welcome to UNACTO's very first event of 2021, Building a Sustainable Toronto, Plans for a Better Future by 2030. As we continue to navigate what is hopefully the latter half of this pandemic, I think it's important that we start looking at what the path to recovery looks like, specifically how cities will respond and adapt to changes in regulations, behavior, and market trends. COVID-19 has hit cities particularly hard as exposed major key challenges in cities such as Toronto. But the silver lining of all of this is that we get to stop, reflect, and reevaluate how we design and interact with our cities. Throughout this panel, you'll see three key themes emerging. The first is how urban planning is going to transform post-COVID. The second is how cities are going to make green spaces and green homes more accessible. And the third is how individuals can help create and contribute to sustainable communities. One of my favorite quotes in the urban planning space, and what actually got me interested, is that the fight against climate change will either be won or lost in cities. I think this panel is a great way to evaluate whether our current game plan is on track to build inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities. Before officially getting started, we do want to take a moment to recognize the land we reside on. We are grateful to have the opportunity to come together on this land and acknowledge that we are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit peoples. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories and recognize that this meeting ground is still home to many indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. As we come together tonight to discuss building a sustainable Toronto, we must ensure that the perspectives of indigenous people both within and outside the city are included in building a sustainable Toronto, especially as we move forward in the spirit of reconciliation. We're now going to start with a brief video message from the Mayor of Toronto, John Tory.
Hi, Mayor John Tory here, extending greetings and thanks to UNACTO for your virtually convening your Building a Sustainable Toronto discussion. Whether it's related to transit expansion, affordable housing, or water quality, building a sustainable Toronto was very much a focus before the pandemic. But COVID-19 has heightened our sense of the gaps in our city that have ended up affecting people the most. The more marginalized you were, or you are, the more you were affected. But it also highlighted the degree to which economic and social and environmental sustainability are so intertwined. If one of the main features of a really sustainable city is the degree to which it is truly inclusive, the pandemic has shown us bad news and good news at the same time. The bad news is that COVID-19 illustrated like never before the degree to which economic disadvantage and marginalization produce an impact far worse for some neighborhoods than others when it comes to something like a public health crisis. And that meant that racialized and newcomer populations suffered more. That isn't just about pandemic statistics or geography. It speaks to the magnitude of the work we have to do on affordable housing, on community supports, on racism, on climate change mitigation, and on inclusion itself. The good news comes from the successes we did have in partnering with grassroots community organizations on everything from food security to testing, vaccinations to mental health supports. And the pandemic also allowed us to take some significant steps forward on rethinking some of our use of public spaces, for example, our mobility options, to prove to ourselves that we could move forward with supportive modular housing in months, not years, and to focus on building things like more bike lanes that residents will use to get around the city in 2021 and in that sustainable city. Going forward, we need to sustain this kind of wartime speed, as I call it, and the partnerships, not just between governments, as important as they may be, but also with the community, with people, with community organizations. And we need people, individual citizens, to be engaged in building up our city as a sustainable city. I am sure that your session will help us in moving that forward, and I thank you for that contribution.
I would now like to pass it on to the moderator of this event. She is an environmental journalist and the founder of EcoHub. Please welcome Candice Batista.
Thank you so much, Ash, and good evening, everybody. I'm so excited and thrilled to be a part of this wonderful event here tonight for the Building a Sustainable Toronto Plans for a Better City by 2030, part of UN's Sustainable Development Goals. As Ash mentioned, my name is Candice Batista, and I've been covering the environment for almost 20 years now. I work full-time at CTV, and I run a website called the Eco Hub. I hope all of you will check it out. We cover everything from sustainable fashion to sustainable cities, biodynamic farming, and lots more. We've got a wonderful evening planned for you. I'm going to take a moment to introduce each one of our amazing panelists, and then we'll hear from each of them. Then we're going to dive into our panel discussion. We'll take all of your questions as well at the end of the panel, so make sure that you put all of your questions into the Q&A section. So let's meet our guests. First up, Maddie Simeotiki is a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning and Canada Research Chair in Infrastructure, Planning and Finance. His research focuses on delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, public-private partnerships, and the effective integration of infrastructure into the fabric of cities. Rochelle Byrne is the founder of the environment non-for-profit A Greener Future, which leads efforts to reduce the impact of litter. To date, they have picked up over 1.6 million pieces of litter. Roya Khaleeli is the Director of Sustainability and Innovation with Minto Communities, where she finds ways to add value to real estate development through sustainability and sharing lessons learned with the wider industry. Susan McGeachie leads Hatch's Global Climate Change as Sustainable Development Practice, which supports clients with strategies to maximize positive social and environmental impacts of projects and investments. Welcome to all of you. So we'll start with Maddie. Maddie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you, Candice. Hello, everyone. What a pleasure to be with you tonight, speaking about urban sustainability. My name is Maddie Simeotiki. I'm the Interim Director of the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. For the last dozen years now, I've been a professor here at the University of Toronto, working on the way that infrastructure integrates into the fabric of cities. And this centrally is about issues of resilience and sustainability. It intersects with ideas around equity and inclusion and a just city and economic prosperity that is available to all. And so we'll speak tonight, I'm sure, about the way that we've built our city has contributed to some of the challenges that we're facing, and a future that, if we do things differently, can be much cleaner, greener, safer, and more just than the one that we have today.
A greener Toronto. Rochelle, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here tonight. So I have been running the nonprofit A Greener Future for the past 6 years, and it's been a great learning experience for me. I am an environmental grad, so I did know a little bit about the environment going into it, but even since then, I just continue to learn, and it's so amazing to be able to connect with individuals through litter cleanups and other events, not so much during the pandemic, but before that. And I've really become aware of the lack of education around just what we do on a daily basis and how intertwined we are with the environment and that connection that we have. So I think for me, just making education, especially around the environment, more accessible and making it something that people get excited about is so important in engaging the community and bringing all these things together to make a sustainable future.
Love that. Roya, tell us about yourself.
Sure. I have a background in mechanical engineering and a master's degree in strategic sustainability, and I consulted in the UK for about 4.5 years to architects, developers, local authorities. So I got some experience in the UK and Europe, and also I worked in the automotive industry for a while. So range of experience there. I've been with Minto for just over 9 years, and working on sustainability. So Minto is a residential developer, and we're also an owner-operator of residential rental buildings, some of which we manage for our investment partners. And the business has been in place for just over 65 years. We're across Canada. And I'm really excited in my role. I have to say, I love my work. I get to work with a range of teams in the business, right from the development team who are buying the land and figuring out what's going to go on the land, all the way through to the construction team and the people that are working day in and day out with our purchasers. So, from that perspective, really getting to see how sustainability integrates with every single department, and trying to move them all forward in what we're trying to achieve. Because at its core, Minto's mission is really to build better places for people. And sustainability is embedded right into that building better.
Sure is. Well, we're looking forward to hearing more from you. Susan, last but not least, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Candice. So Susan McGeachie, I am with Hatch, Climate Change and Sustainability Practice. It's a relatively new practice, but I would say that Hatch has been integrating climate change and sustainability considerations for some time. I joined Hatch from a Big Four. Before that, I worked at in sustainable finance, and before that at World Wildlife Fund. So kind of a varied background in the climate change and environment field. And my role really at Hatch is to pull together all of the initiatives that have been going on in our infrastructure, energy, and mining practices to develop consistent systems approach to understanding, identifying climate change and sustainability related risks as well as opportunities, factor them in where they're prioritize them, I guess, and then factor those priority opportunities and factor in, I guess, some kind of mitigation for some of those risks into all of the projects that we do across all of the three sectors where we work.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, you're all obviously the right people to have on this panel. So I'm so excited to start the panel off, and we're going to jump right into it. So, when we define, or a definition of sustainable city can mean so many different things to so many different people. We need to think about food security. We need to think about access to public transportation, green spaces. So I'd love to know, what is your definition of a sustainable city, and why are interdisciplinary perspectives so important to consider when discussing the environment, the economy, and our society at large? Roya, I'll start with you.
Great. Thanks, Candice. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. There are so many different ways that a sustainable city can be defined. For me, it's the point at which the systems that we are living with, and when I say systems, I mean the transportation systems, or the way in which our homes are developed, or our food system. So when we get to a point where those systems are no longer contributing negatively to the biosphere, and that biosphere, the thin layer of the earth that we all live in, that's when we will have achieved environmental sustainability. So, and I just want to speak for 1 second to the system. So an example is, it's not an issue that we have a few cars that are dependent on fossil fuels. The issue is that our entire transportation system as a whole is set up to be dependent on fossil fuels. Same with housing, same with our food system. So really it's a systems issue. And in the same vein, we can't ignore, and I think this year it's become so clear, we cannot ignore the human aspect. So the way in which we build our cities, we need to ensure that we're not preventing people from meeting their own needs. So are people able to have affordable access? We're touching on this exact thing today. So do people have affordable access to healthy, safe, secure homes in which they can access work easily? So I would point to those two areas, number one, in defining a sustainable city. The second part of your question around the importance of the interdisciplinary element, it's absolutely critical. Because when you are dealing with complex systems, and all of these systems are transportation, housing, food, communication, everything, it's a complex system, you need expertise from a wide range of people to really be able to make change and to address those issues. So for us, I can speak to the work that we do in development. We buy land, and in order to take that land from a piece of land to a place in which people can live, we're constantly working with a range of different people. We have the site servicing team looking at stormwater and how it falls on the site and how it drains off. We're working with the logistic consultants, the transport consultants, trying to figure out how the site can be accessible, et cetera. So there's a range of people that are involved there. Those are some of the larger decisions that we're making. And at a simpler scale, smaller scale, another example I can give you is around our wall assemblies. So when we're looking at building buildings, the foundation of delivering a more energy efficient building is the envelope. We really look at the envelope of the building first. You can get into more efficient mechanicals and renewable energy, but foundationally, you need to look at that envelope. And so we're aware that where policy is going, we need to have buildings that have better envelopes. And so we thought, okay, we'll just look to our architects to ask them, well, what is a better wall assembly that's more insulated? And the architects alone could not give us an answer. We actually had to engage with the energy modelers, with the building science experts, the architects, our internal costing team, and our construction team. So each decision that we want to make an improvement, each system that we want to change and move forward, it really takes a range of expertise.
Sure, it's very interdependent. We seem to be living in a very independent state, and I think that we need to understand the interconnectivity and how everyone, it's very intersectional. We really need to all come together and bring those factors to life. Maddie, did you want to add something?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on some of those ideas and bring in this idea of equity into this definition of sustainability. I think the mayor's opening comments really pick up on how unequal our city is, and we've known this for a long time. This is not news to anyone, but the pandemic has really heightened and accelerated those patterns of inequality. I think one of the ways of thinking about it is we talked about the transportation system, is to think about that in Toronto, the TTC ridership, Toronto Transit Commission ridership, was down at the height of the pandemic in the first wave about 90%. And yet we still had bus routes in this city that were overcrowded. And when you looked at the map of where those bus routes were, they were in the inner suburbs. They were in places where newcomers live, where racialized Torontonians live, and where low-income Torontonians live. People who were trying to get to their frontline jobs, who were going out every day so that many of us could stay home and be safe in our own homes. And I think when we think of this definition of sustainability, it's heightened our demand that we focus on the intersection of the climate crisis alongside these issues of deep inequality and structural racism as well. And I think in doing so, we'll end up with a city that is itself much more resilient and much more equal and just.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, since 2007, more than half of the world's population have been living in cities, and that's expected to rise by about 60% by 2030. So it's substantial. Rochelle, did you want to add something? You kind of touched on this when you introduced yourself, but what does a sustainable city mean to you? Define that for us.
Yeah, I think along the same lines of our other panelists, it is a lot of different people coming together that will create a more sustainable future, because it would be very boring if everybody was an environmentalist. And one of the best things that I have witnessed through the work that I do is that when we have people outside of the environmental field come and join our cleanups or volunteer with us, even doing things like website SEO and things that aren't necessarily environmental, it really helps contribute to our brainstorming and coming up with new ideas and implementing new solutions. So I think it's a very big issue, and there's not one band-aid solution to fix everything. So I think having a whole bunch of people kind of on the case to bring up new ideas and work together, that's really the only way that we're going to get to a point of sustainability.
For sure. And most of you have touched on this. So Susan, I'll start with you with our next question. How has COVID-19 affected your efforts towards sustainability, and how can we rebound from slowed economic activity while maintaining low carbon footprints as we've seen throughout the pandemic? And obviously we're talking about countries that have higher levels of pollution, seeing those pollution levels drop, other areas in the world where you're able to see more of nature than you would have been seeing prior to the pandemic. So Susan, you want to jump into that one?
Sure. For us, COVID-19 actually was this year of planning, which was a surprise to me because we weren't sure what to expect. But with the evolution of and I mean, the systems were always there in terms of not your systems, Roya. I loved your response about the systems approach, but the digital systems. So to access these virtual forums, and it just became this year of planning. So all of our clients, including cities, and I'll talk about maybe at some point the difference between the companies and the cities, just being the companies that are more contained and smaller. I think it's a big challenge for cities, but a huge opportunity. They really were able to come together globally and just say, okay, you know what, we can't get on site. So let's figure out how we're going to meet some of these 2030 goals that we have around emission reduction, around community involvement, around all of the community engagement, social investment. What are we going to be doing to enable certain, kind of marginalized groups, access some of the revenue generating opportunities that previously were excluded from those opportunities. So remember too, with climate change, what we found through the pandemic, and we've touched on this as well, is on the equity. Through the pandemic, we discovered that there is a priority for protecting livelihoods. And during climate change, we didn't really see that. So, when you're talking about, hey, we need to kind of go through this pathway or down this path or down that path, we weren't necessarily saying, what's that going to do to jobs? So that was enshrined in the Paris Agreement. We have to figure out what we're going to do about jobs, because we're not going to move forward if we don't think about what we're going to do about jobs. During COVID, it was this whole coming together of saying, let's take this time with everybody has talked about this, how you need all these different perspectives. Let's take this time with all our little squares, come together and figure out with all of the engineers, the policy people, the finance people, and let's figure out how are we going to make all of these different investments, not just in addressing climate change and mitigating our impact on climate change, but also how are we going to do it in a socially inclusive way? We don't want to be losing jobs. So I think that in that perspective, like from that respect, that's what I noticed with COVID, that we really addressed COVID. In terms of how COVID has changed, or what we could be thinking about is, I'd love to see, and I think we're starting to see this in Toronto. It's been great. Like, there's been a lot of development of bike paths. Now, if we can start to integrate that with access to restaurants, access to businesses, really slowing down the pace so that there's more bike and pedestrian and sort of transit into those hubs, these clusters of businesses that people can get to rather than driving to, kind of superstores. They're actually, kind of that we're developing these clusters around more pedestrian and bike access areas. And I think, COVID shows us that we need some more of, assuming this isn't our last pandemic, and it may not be, we need some access for people to get out and be able to, kind of, we saw in the summer, you need to be able to walk, you need to be able to access things. So if you could have stores that have, kind of takeout windows, and even if it's stores, like whatever it is, but developing that around those areas where people can walk through it. And I think we saw with the urban clusters that was very, very difficult for some of the people to get out. And so I think if we can start to think, and we've already been thinking about this. So if we can start to develop these areas. And then my last little point is to develop that revenue generating cash flow opportunity around it. So figuring that out, this is hard for cities, and that's the difference that I'll highlight a little bit for companies. For cities to think about, okay, so if we're going to develop this whole plan, how are we going to link it to, cash flow generation, revenue generation, so that we can access private money, and that's still a bit of a gap right now.
I think you touched on something that really resonated with me, and it was also just really about shopping locally. We've really seen the importance, like as an environmentalist and someone who teaches people or helps people rather, empowers them to live a greener life. One of the best things you can do is go for a walk in your own neighborhood and find some of those wonderful stores. And I think that COVID has really opened those doors up. It's really given us a sense of how important our local community is and how we can support them. Maddie, I know you wanted to add something to that as well.
It was exactly on that point, and picking up on Susan's comments as well, that I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a big debate raging amongst urbanists anyways about whether this was the end of cities and whether people were going to flee to lower density suburbs, and this was going to kick off a new round of low-rise development out into the hinterlands, and people were going to flee to cottage country and work from their wired cottage. I think what we've actually found is exactly to Susan's point, and what you were saying, Candice, as well, that people actually still want to be in places that there are other people. We are a species that thrives on being around others. And that goes for our social interactions, that goes for our recreation and the way that we use public spaces, and it goes for our shopping as well. And I think what's actually happened, and I'd be really interested to hear Roya's thoughts on this, because I was struck during the first wave of the pandemic that I would have expected that people who were building mid-rise and high-rise communities to sort of down tools and maybe say, this is now getting pretty risky. We're going to stop building. We're going to stop investing. We're going to wait, take a bit of a wait and see attitude here. And instead, what's happening is many, both on the public sector side communities and developers have actually doubled down on their investments in complete communities. And it's the complete communities part of it that is relevant, that they've recognized that the power of good city building is more important than ever before. And if they can come up with ways of layering in appropriate green space with local retail, with active transportation, with affordable housing and social services, these are the types of communities that are resilient to something like a pandemic. And we've sometimes heard it said that the pandemic is a dry run for climate change, and the even bigger upheaval that could come if climate change really accelerates at the pace that it's forecast, and if we do nothing to arrest our emissions. And so I think actually the city building outcomes that you and Susan were speaking of are really a powerful way of reacting, and one of the interesting responses. And the mayor picked up on this idea of wartime speed, that things that were taking decades were suddenly being done in a matter of weeks and months. So, the bike lanes on Danforth here in Toronto are a perfect example. There were proposals for those bike lanes in the year 2000. We are 20 years on, and we were going to redebate them and have another round of public forums after years of doing it. And then the pandemic struck, and within a matter of weeks, the bike lanes are open. They included, exactly like what Susan was talking about, cafes, that it gave space for cafes to spill out into the public realm. And all of a sudden, a street that was really struggling was then very lively in a space that could be a people place. And I think it's that attitude of that can-do attitude, and that attitude of moving quicker and figuring out how to break down the barriers and work collaboratively across disciplines that I think will get us much further along to these complete communities coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I had the chance to talk to David Suzuki a few times in my career, and he talked exactly about that. And he always says, that we've developed everything. We developed the cities, we developed the economy, and we do have the power to change it and change it really quickly. And we've definitely seen that. We've definitely seen that we are absolutely able to do that. Rochelle, I'd love to talk and get kind of your sense of how COVID has affected your efforts towards sustainability. I know that, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, mentioning how it's a little bit more challenging right now to get out into the community and pick up litter. So maybe talk a little bit about the importance of doing that and how you've pivoted during COVID, how it's affected you and your community.
Yeah, so we were used to doing over 100 litter cleanups every year along the shores of Lake Ontario and having hundreds of volunteers come out and join us. So when we had to cancel all of our public events, we had to think pretty quickly about how we could make things work. And I mean, eventually the pandemic will be over and we'll get back to having all those volunteers, which will be wonderful. But in the meantime, we had to come up with ways that people could be involved and engaged with the work we do virtually. And I mean, we've done fairly well. We do have more volunteers coming out and you know, like doing cleanups independently, which is amazing. But I think what's more important is that we've built a community, a virtual community of people who really want to be engaged with other people who care about the same thing. And I really love that we can connect, whether even though it is digitally, that we can connect and talk about, you know, like what we're seeing out in the world and how we're feeling about things and come up with new ideas and just really support each other through this, because it is a difficult time for a lot of people. And I think just the increase in volunteers that we have seen at A Greener Future is a really good indication that shows people want to be part of the solution.
That's awesome. That's awesome. How about you, Roya? I know that Maddie had mentioned that you could probably weigh in, just thinking about how we can rebound from a slowed economy and how to maintain, you know, lower carbon footprints. And from a building and development standpoint, how do you guys fit into all of that?
Yeah, great. Put me on the spot, Maddie. So a couple of things. I will say that we did continue to sell homes through the pandemic. We did it in a very safe way, of course, you know, absolutely. So yeah, people were still buying homes and we were still selling homes. So it looked different and the pace was slightly different, but it was still happening, number one. Number two, I have to speak to the length of the development process. So, and I didn't know this until I got into development 9 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe longer. But each time we're building a new community, it's taking us 7 to 8 years. So you imagine the pandemic is hitting us now, and the implications of the pandemic are really only going to get factored into the projects that we're designing right now. Because the projects that are already under construction, already underway, they've been tendered, the contracts are signed. And I know I'm getting into some really technical stuff, but those are the realities of development. It takes a really, really long time. However, I think each of you have touched on it. We've seen how those perceptions around what is and isn't possible have fallen away a little bit. And I'm really excited to see what happens with that going forward. And maybe there's an element of developers and the cities working together in a different way. I don't know right now what that looks like, because again, we're still actually figuring a lot of that stuff out. I can also offer that. So I mentioned at the beginning, sustainability isn't new for Minto. We've been focused on it from the very early days that the business launched over 65 years ago. So most recently, I would say in the last 2 to 3 years, we've really started to focus on health and wellness, because we see how important that is. And we've known for a long time that buildings and homes really do have a big impact on the health and wellness of people. And I think what we've seen with the COVID pandemic is that work is now even more important. And so, you know, I mean, a small example is ventilation systems. It's a traditional condo building. You're getting your fresh air into your unit through air being forced into the corridor, and then that air making its way, hopefully, into your unit. Whereas we've been implementing fresh air systems that go directly into each residential condo unit for a long time. And so that in itself creates a healthier space for people. So we're continuing to look at how to address that health and wellness piece alongside the pandemic. Yeah.
And just a reminder to everybody watching, if you have questions for our panelists, please go ahead and start sending them now. Just type them into the Q&A section. So we're going to move on to question 3, which is a really important question, and we have touched on this quite a bit. How do you balance sustainability and accessibility among vulnerable communities and people? So for example, how can we help low-income households reduce their carbon footprint without increasing their cost of living? And how can we make green homes more affordable to first-time home buyers, or even how to make sure at-risk communities have access to essential services such as public transit, fresh foods, shelter, etc. So we'll start with you, Maddie. I guess the really big thing is, you know, we can't. So I'll just let you take it away. I lost my train of thought.
Sure. Yeah. And I think what you were getting at there is we can't put the burden of sustainability on the lowest income. And what I would say is, I think that's such an important point, because what's happening right now is actually, it's not the lowest income people who have made this mess. Low income people are more likely to be using transit. They're more likely to be living in very small spaces, often overcrowded spaces, in buildings that where they're not necessarily using that much energy. So this is, you know, the emissions that are happening are because of the way we use our transportation systems and the larger vehicles, which tend to be driven more by people who are wealthy and people living in much larger homes that are far away from where they work. And so I think to the bigger point then about how we build communities, one of the areas I've been working in a lot lately has been in this idea of what we call creative mixed use buildings. It's the idea that as a city intensifies and grows upwards rather than outwards, it creates revenue, it creates value from the additional density that can be reinvested into public services and public spaces. And the thinking, if you think about a building, think about what happens on the first and second floor. So at the moment, the current model, we do mixed use buildings, but the current model is essentially a mid-rise or high-rise building with a dry cleaners and perhaps a coffee shop, and maybe a pharmacy and a pizza shop on the main floor. And that's fine, but I think we can go so much further in capturing some of the value from intensification and reinvesting it in the types of public and social services that are necessary for a thriving city. So Toronto is actually under the radar, a bit of a world leader in this type of development. So we've built schools that have condos directly up above them, for example. The Tiff Bell Lightbox is an important facility, important arts and culture facility. We have upscale condos that have a homeless shelter for women and children built right, and families built right into the side of it, which is again an important way of capturing some of the value of the development that took place on that site and reinvesting it into important critical social services. We have YMCAs, we have student residences, all sorts of ways of pushing the envelope to see development, so that we're not, it's maximizing this idea of development without displacement, so that we're not driving gentrification, but we're allowing our city to grow and reinvesting the profits from that into the public realm so that it's shared equally, and that we can address some of these issues also around affordable housing and integrating affordable housing into the developments that are taking place.
And how do you think we can achieve that? Would that have to come through policy?
So it's already happening. I think that's what's exciting, is that it's already happening at the building by building stage. And that we have, my research shows there are about 50 buildings, what we call creative mixed use buildings already in Toronto, that have a large scale public use and a large scale private use in the same building. And they're kind of scattered across the city. And for the most part, they've happened in some ways under the radar, and always a tortured process, like years in the making, always a roller coaster, always at risk of failure. And I think what we're starting to see the pandemic has led to is a drive for these to become intentional and a first priority rather than a last resort. So just to give you one very brief example, the city of Brampton is redeveloping, is in the process of redeveloping a site very large site that's owned by RioCan called Shoppers World. And at the heart of this major redevelopment is what they're calling a community hub, which is going to have a school in it. It's going to have a library in it, a daycare in it, and some other uses that are integrated into this single building that maximize the value of intensification and enable a community core to be built early in the process so that the community can grow around this really important public facility.
Susan, I'd love to hear your side of it as well. When we think about sustainability and accessibility, especially within vulnerable communities, how do you see us facilitating that or actually getting that done?
So very narrow is, and we've just done this. So it's funny you ask, because I normally didn't put a lot of thought into that, to be honest. But a team at Hatch has developed a model for thinking about the costs of accessibility and the return on investment of that accessibility, so that with the developers, they can give an alternative option in terms of the price of development. And so this would be the price of accessibility, and this would be the return on investment from accessibility. And we use, so I worked with them tangentially on creating that model, and we used, kind of SROI, so social return on investment metrics, where it can be difficult to quantify, but you pick the social benefits, and then you find proxies to quantify those social benefits, and then you work with the developers. And I just want to pull on Roya's comment about development being such a long timeline. We are in, from a UN Global Compact Sustainable Development Goal perspective, we are in a decade of action, right? Like, we have to make the investments last year, this year, maybe next year, if we are going to see the return on those investments from that social environmental benefits perspective. If we're going to see those by 2030, if we're going to achieve what we want to achieve, the sustainable city that we want to achieve, we have to see these investments today. So we're going to have to figure out, how do we model it appropriately to demonstrate what can be prioritized, what can be the correct financing. Because, Maddie's point, if we invest in, what's so great about the SROI model is you can quantify the value to government, where if you can invest in these programs, and it's maybe not appealing to private investor, however, you're going to save a lot of money on a government side that they would have to be spending otherwise on addressing outcomes, negative social outcomes down the road. So if we can invest today in these social programs, then you are going to save, X amount of millions of dollars, by 2030. So we've been working on that model, so that every infrastructure project that we do now will have that lens, so to enable decision making.
Roya, you're somebody who's in the building industry, so I'd love to know, how do we make green homes, green condos more affordable to people in low income communities? Like, what would we need to do in order to make that happen?
Sure. I will speak to two things. One is, first I'll say, I wish there was an easy answer, right? But again, it's complex. And I think in this case, it really does require us working with all levels of government. So we've actually built some affordable housing in Etobicoke. And we did that in part through accessing some funding that was available through the City of Toronto. So we built an affordable seniors housing rental building, which I think we launched in 2012. And we're actually building another affordable housing apartment building now. It's I think construction is starting this year. And both of those projects were able to move forward in part through partnering with the city. The one that we're working on right now is through the Open Doors program. Yeah, I can speak to that working with cities and accessing that type of funding is one. I think the other side of making homes affordable is the operating costs of homes. We spend a lot of time talking about the purchase price of homes, but if people are buying homes that aren't energy efficient, then the portion of their monthly income, annual income, et cetera, that's going to be going towards utilities is going to be much larger. And we know that utility costs are going to continue to increase year after year. So I think part of the way that we've addressed it, and not just because of the pandemic again, and not just because social issues are at the forefront today, we've been doing this for a long time. We've understood that by delivering homes that are more energy efficient, we are reducing those utility bills for our home buyers and protecting them from the increasing costs of utilities. So those are the two ways that I can speak to right now.
And so would that also mean, implementing solar panels? I read a really interesting article today on the CBC that said that solar technology is really growing, but Canadians are actually the one country that we're not grabbing onto that idea yet. And why do you think that is, Maddie? Let's go to that for you. I'm just curious to know. It's such a great thing to harness the energy of the sun, yet we don't get a lot of it here in Canada, albeit, but we do get some. It is, do you think there's misconceptions around that we need to try to get past?
So I think there's a few things. I think one is we're a cold weather country. And so we're either cold weather or cloudy on our West Coast. So in some ways we think that solar won't work for us. I actually don't think that's true. I think in many ways there's, parts of our country get a lot of sun. Also wind. Wind is another option that can be very effective in certain areas. I would say we have a risk aversion in many cases that's making it hard for us to implement these green energy programs. Some of the ways that they've been rolled out have been challenging, and they've run into community opposition if the consultation is not very well done, or if it seems like all the information is not available, or there's a perception of a hidden agenda that can cause problems. So we've had trouble rolling out these ideas of green energy, but you're seeing that change as communities across the country recognize that things like wind or solar can really become parts of their energy portfolio. And I would say where it's really going to take hold is at the sort of building and operator level, because there's a lot of room on the rooftops of our buildings, for example. So public buildings could be putting energy solar panels on their roofs, and then capitalizing on some of the economics, some of the revenue that comes in from those systems in order to pay for their other services. So there's all sorts of, this is a finance question as well, and a project delivery question as well. And other countries have got there faster. In fact, Denmark just today announced this massive offshore wind project, like the size of something like, 18 football fields, and this massive wind array that can power up to 3 million homes. I mean, this is the scale that other countries think at. Denmark also, in Copenhagen, put in place a new power plant that has a ski slope built right onto it. I mean, the type of imagination and thinking that is happening in other parts of the world when it comes to green energy is stunning. And I think Canada, it's not to throw caution to the wind, but it's really to recognize that the world is changing very quickly. And if we want to be part of that changing world, we're going to have to start moving a lot quicker than we do.
Yeah, for sure. And even something as simple as a green roof, does wonders for climate change or urban heat effect and all that kind of stuff. Well, let's move on to the next question. Rochelle, I'm going to aim this one at you. How can individuals in the GTA help support environmental stewardship, and what corporations and organizations and what kind of organizations can we reach out to support and help consumers make more sustainable choices?
Yeah, it's a big question because, I mean, a lot of people do want to get involved, but they just don't know where to go, where to look. Even with me trying to find volunteers, it can be challenging because I don't have a big budget to market to volunteers. so it takes some time to like reach them and find them and really like get connected with them. So having volunteers come to us is really helpful. And to make that happen, there's a lot of other things that need to happen first, because like you'd think with Toronto being a big city with millions of people, I could just put up a little ad online and say, come to my cleanup, and like hundreds of people would show up. But I actually have a better turnout at my events in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is a tiny community, compared to the events that I host in Toronto. And I'm not sure if it's because there's just so many things going on that people are tied up doing other things, or if I just get drowned out. So I think just having corporations and the government work with nonprofits to spread the word about the work they're doing, so that more people can get involved and learn about the work that they're doing. Because for me, it's not just about picking up garbage. That's how I got started, but there's a lot more to it. And I think once people kind of get that taste of what we're doing, it feels good to kind of keep coming back and doing more and learning more. And for me, I started with picking up garbage, and that has kind of changed into me like researching into what it's like to live a zero waste lifestyle, and really like looking at all different aspects of my life to see what I can do. So like doing research is a huge contributor to reaching that level of environmental stewardship. And I think for people to be able to access that information, we need to be able to share it more widely and get it into the hands of people that are looking for it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's an interesting point that you make, especially using, a smaller community like Niagara-on-the-Lake versus a big city like Toronto. And I think from my perspective and all the work that I've done, I think that a lot of the times what I see is that people that live in cities, not all people, but in my general, the people I'm around seem more disconnected from nature. There's people that, we live on a lake. Like we're very disconnected as a society from nature, where I think that especially in cities, and I think that disconnect is what creates a lot of the issues. And then also in a small city like Niagara-on-the-Lake, people are right on the lake. It's a small community and they really value that environment, the actual environment. I think that does play into it. Susan, what about you? How do you think people can be more engaged, and what can we be doing to get people, consumers, more interested in sustainability, really?
It's a bit outside my area of expertise in terms of working with more of the systems approach. So I mean, for me, it totally anecdotally, having a cottage, growing up with a cottage, and watching people now come up and throw their trash out the window. So now I'm going for a walk on the cottage road and there's trash. I mean, trash. Like, this is 3 hours from Toronto. So I do agree with you, Candice, that there needs to be a connection, and Rochelle as well, like picking up that litter and seeing the impact of that litter with in where you're operating. I think anything that's transient. So as cottage country becomes more maybe less ownership, which is fine, which is great, right? I think there should be more access to our wonderful lakes. How can we take the people passing through and connect them to, you might be leaving, but other people are coming next weekend, and the trash is not great for them.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? And also those bike lanes that we were talking about, that Maddie was talking about, that I mentioned right at the beginning, building those bike lanes, building the ability to the pedestrian friendly areas around lakes. So we used to develop a lot of housing on lakes. Well, now I think Toronto's actually made a concerted effort not to do that. And so building those bike lanes along the lake so that you see the lake, you interact with the lake. People east and west can ride their bikes into downtown when we go back to work. along the lake. So when you're constantly seeing that, and I know I'm not speaking to maybe northern, but there Lake Simcoe's not that far from Toronto either. So how can we develop more of those trails so that people can get through towns and cities with a trail? Because then you're connected with nature. You're connected. Your commute to work, if you're going by bike, is connected to nature. And if you are seeing trash, you just want to be seeing that litter. And so anecdotally, I wonder if that's one of the solutions.
No, it's so interesting. I think that litter is such an interesting thing, because a lot of the times, like, I spend a lot of time in nature, I hike quite a bit, and plastic is just part of the landscape now. It's actually abnormal if you don't see a piece of plastic in the environment. So I think there needs to be more awareness around just the plastic crisis, but we'd have to save that for another show, because that's a big one. You, Roya, I just, like, as a personal, how do you see people getting more involved and consumers getting more involved in sustainability? We've got about 2 minutes to wrap this question up.
Sure, I'll be quick. I'll be speedy. So I think the biggest way people can take action is in the everyday choices that they make. And for me, just on the waste piece, I've started shopping at places where I take my own bags. I take my own boxes. So, I'm giving a shout out to Bulk Barn. They've started doing that. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, they've stopped. Unboxed Market, amazing. They've continued. I love it. And not only do I will just say I feel good when I leave.
Yeah.
The second thing I'll say is, as a home builder, I would say home buyers need to use their voice and ask home builders for what they want to see. I mentioned, sorry, there's a dog in the hallway. So I mentioned that, our developments take a really long time. And so there's a really big level of risk involved. And so if we know for sure our home buyers are asking for certain sustainable features, it makes it so much easier for us to put it in. And we are, just going back to the solar panel piece, we are working on how to deliver net zero energy homes. So low-rise homes that produce as much energy as they use.
Wow.
But again, the market needs to tell us that they want these, and that they're willing to, they are going to cost a bit more. But it means that your utility bills are going to be zero. Your energy bills are going to be zero, pretty much. The other piece I will just say really quickly is that I think some of the biggest change can be made through encouraging our political leaders to legislate for change. But with that, we really need to have industry involved in fleshing out and getting into the details of what that legislation looks like. Because, it would be unfortunate to implement it, but then industry not be able to deliver on it because it isn't practical and affordable. But again, that integration piece is really important.
Yeah, you raise a good point. And speaking of policy, that leads us into our last question. So what innovation or policy changes are you most looking forward to in your industry that will accelerate our progress in achieving SDG 11? So Susan, I'm going to start with you.
I'm really excited about the innovative financing. I actually think the financiers, the private capital, which we know we need in terms of the sustainable cities, the sustainable infrastructure, they have an unprecedented interest in financing sustainable outcomes. They're linking it to the SDGs. They're trying to understand, how their financing will affect positive or negative outcomes toward achieving the SDGs. So for governments to start working with them, it does happen in other countries where you can finance sustainable outcomes because the city, the municipalities have structured the deals in that way. I have found that the financiers here, they're very interested, they're open, they're all ears, but they're not necessarily, they can go globally. They can go and look for those deals. They don't have to go and have those deals set up here. So it does require our governments to be proactive, to work with them to say, how can we structure, green energy investments if it's going to cost us more, say, and we have to pay for it. If it's going to cost, Minto more, what is it we need to do to make this appealing for your financing, and how can we do it in such a way that you can parcel off a piece of it that meets the private capital needs, which is, maximizing returns. Although I would say there's an unprecedented interest in not necessarily maximizing returns, but also understanding sustainable outcomes. But also then separating out what's worth government, then taking the other piece that's not appealing to finance and saying, but this will save us money. So that was what I was talking about earlier, to understand the social return on investment. So in year 10 or year 5, you're going to be saving on other social bills that you're spending on right now. I'd also say the Sustainable Finance Expert Panel, they did mention this, policy innovators. I'd love to see that implemented. And I know the expert panel's recommendations, all levels of government are interested in implementing their recommendations, and it is policy innovators. So, again, I'll point at Minto. Certainly our clients have this issue where you can identify a different way of developing, and it could be more sustainable, but there are policy impediments. And so, engaging with government all the time to change that, it's just easier to go to code. Right? But if you can have assigned people to say, look, here's an issue, we could develop this in a way that's more resilient, we could develop it in a way that's more accessible, and here's the barrier for us, and leave them to go do that, because it can be a tangle to work through policy, right? So have those policy innovators to go in and do that piece of it. And then I would say, and this speaks to Roya's point as well, in terms of the systems approach, the integration, having those climate change and sustainability offices within cities we have now, which is great. So the next step is giving them meaningful traction to work with all the different city departments. I think that's still a bit of a work in progress. But if we can make all development decisions, like for example, Toronto has had a plan, I don't even know if it's still in place, but I remember they had this plan, a strategy that they were going to increase the Toronto canopy by 40%. Well, 70% of that, and I may be mixing up my percentages, but 70%-ish was in backyards. But that didn't necessarily, that strategy, so you have to protect the canopy of those backyards, but that strategy didn't translate into development decisions. If you were going to build a condo, or if you're going to build a new housing unit, housing complex or whatever. So we've got to be having our sustainability strategies, and then it has to link with every single department's decision and how they move forward.
That's a great answer. Maddie, can that be done?
Well, I think for me, the takeaway and the way forward is this sense of urgency. I think like we could dissect all of the policies, and in this city, sometimes they work at cross purposes. Some of the transit decisions are head scratchers. The fact that we're still in the process of planning what seems to be a $10 billion highway in the west end of the city, the GTA West highway extension, which has gotten almost no attention recently. I mean, some of these are total head scratchers, but I think to more broadly around this issue of sustainability, the sense of urgency that's out there now to link environmental sustainability and environmental goals with the social goals and what I guess we could call social prosperity, where it's broadly distributed. I think that the pandemic has just revealed something that we can't look away from. We can't unsee what we've seen, and between that and the attention around systemic racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, I think we're in a moment now where the policy is going to be moving at a pace that's much quicker. And I would say, Roya mentioned this earlier, like there is a value to policy moving faster. Like if it's taking 7-8 years to move a project from start to finish, and we can create other pathways that can move a project much faster if it has social benefits, that the value of time there is a real value that has monetary financial values. And if we can find ways of accelerating the policies that deliver a green future, whether it's around transportation, bike lanes. I would also say bus only lanes, especially in the inner suburbs. We could be providing people with much better access so quickly just by getting out there and putting some dedicated bus lanes in. I think these are the type, and then on the development side, encouraging these creative mixed use buildings through policy. I think we could be moving very quickly towards a more sustainable future.
And do we do that by pressuring politicians, by writing to your local politician, telling them what you do? Like, how do we actually get politicians to do it? That's the burning question, right?
Well, part of the secret to this is the politicians they tend to be the ones who they don't tend to lead the parade. They tend to look where the parade is and then get in the line and try to work their way up to the front of it. So it's up to us. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche in a democracy, but the politicians represent the people. And if we are telling them that we want a more sustainable future and we want a future that is more equal and just, then the people who get elected will be people who represent those views. And I would also just add very quickly, the people who we have been voting for historically do not represent the demographics of our city, not even close. Look at the demographics of city council and compare them to the demographics of our city. In terms of gender and in terms of race. I mean, it's not even close. And I think, there are social movements out there that are trying to break down those barriers as well. But the democratic accountability and the way that people get elected and who is getting elected, I think that is on all of us. It's partly about lobbying them once they're in office, and more importantly, during those election campaigns, it's really digging in and scrutinizing who's going to be out there promoting for a more equal future.
Sure, and supporting organizations who are also lobbying.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. There are people out there doing this work who've been doing it for decades, and we should be supporting them. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So we have a couple more minutes. I'll come to you, Roya, and then we'll end it off with you, Rochelle, with this question, and then we're going to start taking audience questions. So, Roya, you were referenced quite a few times in the answer to that question. What would you like to add?
So I will share our definition of innovation, because part of your question linked to innovation. So our definition of innovation is trying to solve specific challenges that add value to our home buyers, our employees, et cetera, or the communities that we're building in. And so value, of course, I don't mean just financial value. So a much wider scope of what value is. So health and wellness, comfort, et cetera. I'm really excited. So we break innovation into a few different veins. One is the product. So our homes we refer to our homes as a product. And so the stuff that goes into those homes, I'm excited to see movement on embodied carbon. I think that's going to make a difference. Embodied carbon is, it's the carbon that is part of the full life cycle of the materials that we're using. So I'm excited about that. I think it's going to be, there was a few of them, and I'm actually just going to check my list now. Transportation reform, we've talked about that one internally a little bit. So what would it look like if we didn't have to integrate as much parking into our condo towers? It would definitely help to make those buildings more affordable. Or what could that space look like in some of the older buildings? What could that parking space be changed into? Another one I'll speak to, another innovation I'll speak to that I'm really excited to see become helpful for us is the modular construction. There's a number of things happening in the industry where I think modular construction is really going to make a difference in terms of trade availability and retiring of a number of the building inspectors. I keep hearing that, and I think modular construction is really going to make a difference there and help to reduce the waste element. There was one other thing I wanted to speak to. Susan spoke about the financial piece, and I will just say we are seeing financial models come online today that are that didn't exist a few years ago. So for example, ground source energy, where you're accessing you're leveraging the constant temperatures of just below the ground to deliver energy systems that are heating and cooling in a much more energy efficient way. Being able to deliver that type of a system, it's very capital intensive. And so when we looked at these systems 5-7 years ago, the business models that were in place then didn't allow us to make sense of it for our projects. But today there are, I think the proper term is deferred capital models. So we're entering into 30-year contracts. So when we're setting up our condos, we're looking. We don't have one where we fully confirmed this yet, but these models are now available. So the condo will enter into a 30-year agreement with an energy provider, and it's renewable energy. They've paid the capital to integrate the system into the condo building, and then through lower maintenance fees, a lower cost of energy, the condo pays that capital back. And so that's opening up a much wider range of opportunities. So I'm excited about that.
That's really interesting. So Rochelle, we're going to come to you very quickly. You're the youngest one on the panel here, and you're going to be your generation is hopefully going to be the saviors for all of me old people. But what's your perspective on this?
I think we're at a very important time in history. And even just before the pandemic started, climate change was starting to really ramp up with all the protests and that sort of thing that were going on. And they were led by youth. So I am really excited about what's becoming of our youth, and that they're starting to speak up and they're using their voices, and there are so many projects out there that are funding youth innovation. So I'm really excited to see where this goes. And, I'm really inspired by all these young people that are really taking action and becoming leaders and really pushing things forward and learning and teaching others and just really getting invested in our future. Because I think before, everyone just kind of assumed, oh yeah, in the future it's going to be the same as it is now, but maybe we'll drive flying cars. But now we're at a point where if we don't make changes, it could end badly. So I think having all the youth really rising up and taking action and using their voices is so important to move us to that next level.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's been like, as someone who's been doing this for a really long time, and I want to throw in the towel a lot, because sometimes I'm like, how am I still talking about this stuff 20 years later? So the Fridays for Future and that entire movement was very uplifting and gave me a lot of hope. Well, this has been a wonderful panel so far, and we've got still lots more to go. So now we're going to start taking some questions. So our first question says, what types of specific support and or incentives, financial or otherwise, do municipalities need from higher levels of government to reach Canada's climate goals? Maddie, do you want to start with that one? I send you all the financial questions.
Yeah, and Susan could probably answer some of these as well. I think we need frameworks that support sustainable choices. And we've had a very long and fractured debate about the carbon tax, and economists, most economists will tell you that the carbon tax is one way to very quickly change behavior. That what you price and how you pay for things, that influences people's behavior. So that setting out these frameworks, which the federal government has worked at and has had mixed results with their provincial counterparts, that has been one aspect. The other piece is senior levels of government providing funding for things like transit, being one, and affordable housing and sustainability built into their housing. And this federal government is talking about a $100 billion infrastructure plan, as well as a national housing strategy, which is meant to integrate all of these ideas around that every dollar really tries to give you a few benefits. One benefit is job creation from the construction, but also a climate and mitigation benefit, and an inclusion, a social inclusion benefit too. So you're really trying to, this triple bottom line on the money that's being spent. Now, I will just say quickly, to not be too optimistic about this, in Canada, we have a real problem with with how we make decisions and ensuring that the money we spend actually is achieving the outcomes that it's intended to achieve and deliver. And so I think using evidence to make decisions consistently and collecting data, that has been like one of the most overused sayings through the pandemic is we don't have the data. And I would say when it comes to sustainability and the outcomes of our investments from senior levels of government and the incentives, we often don't actually have the data to be able to tell whether the projects that we're building are actually the ones that are delivering the real world sustainability goals. So I think in building in the policies around how we pay for infrastructure and then having money going towards projects that are delivering this triple bottom line is really going to be a way that the senior levels of government can deliver on that promise to municipalities.
Absolutely. Susan, would you like to weigh in on that?
Well, sure. I mean, to build on Maddie's point, as well as Candice, a point you made from David Suzuki's quote, and also Roya talking about the new financial model, is that we developed the financing system. We developed our finance system, and we can change our finance system to meet our needs. And we haven't. We've still been, kind of thinking about it in a very traditional way. And so these models, these new models, they're coming online. So there are ways to stretch out the payments, and banks are interested in figuring that out. We can support, government can support, rather than just giving a grant or a sort of a transfer to the municipalities. They can actually support so that banks can lend in kind of a 10-year loan instead of a 4-year loan in their traditional sense. So as Roya was saying, you want to stretch out the timeline to pay for these capital investments. So, I think that is, definitely a solution. The finance sector has long said this, and we have one of the world's best, investor base. So let's get them involved. And instead, they're getting involved internationally. And one of the criticisms that they've made time and time again is that the 3 levels of government can overrule something. And I think this is what Maddie's saying too, is that you can have a decision at one level, and then another government new government, and it can overrule it, but also different provincial or federal governments can overrule it. So you need that certainty. So we need to understand what is it that we want to achieve and get all 3 levels of government aligned, and then depoliticize it. So you can structure, like this was for the 407, and I mean that's an investment that it was cash flow positive. Maybe we can start to take more, instead of highways, right? Some of the ideas that we're talking about, and you can enshrine these investments so that they're outside the political sphere. So for they'll come with policy, and then you wrap them up, and it's now outside. And so those revenues are guaranteed. We identify which ones can be cash flow positive, so you can get the finance sector involved. And then, as I was saying earlier, you identify where the government has to be involved. The government has to backstop some of these areas, and you start to link it, as Maddie was saying, with the social benefits, so that the government can have a clear picture of how much they'll be saving over time if they invest this money now.
Yeah, well said. Let's go to the next question. Is there a plan for sustainable housing for old rental buildings? They are usually ones that consume more and need more maintenance. Roya, I would love you to jump in on that one.
Great question. Yeah, we actually have a whole team at Minto that focuses on how to improve the performance of our rental portfolio. So year after year, they're doing assessments on how the buildings are performing, what equipment needs to be changing, et cetera. We also have our eye on the potential that existing buildings are net zero by 2050. And although that's 30 years away, we have to start doing the work today to understand what our capital investments need to be in order to achieve that. So I think I mentioned earlier that the foundation of a well-performing building is its envelope. What you can imagine, an envelope retrofit isn't something that we do on a regular basis, and it is incredibly expensive. So, but that is an area that we're beginning to dig into. We've had some external consultants come, take a look at some of our buildings, understand what would it take? What would it take to get this envelope improved so that the amount of energy that it takes to run the building is going to be much less? So that's one way in which we're improving some of our older buildings. But for us, it's constant.
Sure.
It's embedded in how we run our business, and it's constant year in, year out, just continuing to look at new and different technologies. I would also say there's been some big progress made in building automation systems. So you want smart building. I mean, it's such a loaded word. It can mean so many different things, but using technology and sensors to help understand effectively to deliver the building, to operate it in a way that's much more efficient. I'll keep it simple.
Yeah, I mean, and what you said earlier is I find it interesting that it's much more expensive to retrofit a home than it is to build a brand new green home. Like, you're better off to actually build it from the ground up. You're actually going to spend less than having to go in and fix all the different things inside your home. And that's where we need to see a lot of change. Rochelle, my next question is for you. We'll start with you. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's an important question. Since the pandemic started, we haven't had a chance to engage in eco-cleaning, like pick up litter days or clean up your neighborhood days. So what are some alternatives in this kind of scenario, and what can individuals do to make a change? And I really want you to focus on the individuals, because you talked earlier about joining different programs, coming on Zoom calls like that, but what can the individual do so that we can actually feel a little bit more empowered?
Yeah, I think, and it's a really big struggle, because when you're stuck in your house and you can't go anywhere, it can feel really, it's hard. I mean, there's no other way to explain it, especially if you are a very social person and you love to get involved in your community and there's nothing to do. So there are some virtual opportunities out there, depending on what your skill level is or how you want to get involved. So look for those. I know Volunteer Toronto posts a lot of opportunities, as well as Charity Village. So that might be a really good place to start looking for volunteer opportunities that speak to you. But another thing is just look at what your community is up to and get involved with like other businesses that are like trying to survive this pandemic. So zero waste shops, and just, you know, like little local places, little cafes, that kind of thing, and see if they have anything going on, and try and build those connections within your community. I think it can be difficult because we're not out and about, but I think more than ever, it's important just to go onto their website and see what they're doing. Buy from them virtually if you can, and you know, just if they have an Instagram, go follow them. And then maybe you can start a conversation that way. It's all these little things that really add up to a big deal, right? So I think for us with A Greener Future, having more people join the conversation through our Instagram or through our Facebook, and sending us direct messages and asking questions, and just getting involved either a little bit or a little bit more if they're really eager, is so important to us. And I hope that our volunteers are getting something out of it too, and that they feel like they're part of our community. Because I think at the end of all of this, when we can actually get back out and be together in person, it's going to be different, because I think we really have realized what we've missed. And I think being a volunteer, or being connected to your community, or meeting new people, or just being outside and like interacting with other people is going to be far more important to everybody after this is all over. So I think just taking the next steps to learn more about your community and see where you can get involved. And even if it's just signing a petition for something, like every action does count. So I think every step you can take is a step in the right direction.
And small things that you can do at home, like learn about what you can recycle in your own city, because it's so confusing. But honestly, lots of cities, like the city of Toronto, has the waste wizard. You just type it in there and the answer pops up. So I think that's such a basic thing, but I think it's so important. So we've got about 4 minutes left. I'm going to end on this question. It's kind of a big question, but I think it's an important question. Poverty and homelessness have increased since the outbreak of the pandemic at an alarming rate. And simultaneously, studies have shown that less people have been buying condos, yet condos continue being built all over the city, and more tent cities keep cropping up. What are real estate developers doing to address poverty and homelessness? Obviously, you guys are a business, but do you see a role that communities can play? And what are your plans moving forward in terms of affordable housing? So we'll do Roya, and then we'll go to you, Maddie.
So I will speak to, Minto isn't the city, right? So Minto has individual projects that we build throughout the city. So I will say that the approach that we take is with each, whether it's a condo or a community that we're building, we really try and understand what the needs are for the people in that community. And we try and work with them to integrate our condo in a way that is somehow also addressing the needs of the people in that area. I think, I think that's how we would go about it. And that's in part through how we're building our condo, but I think it's also in part through how we engage with the communities as we're there and building.
Yeah.
So that's how I would respond.
Maddie, and then we'll end with.
So thanks for the question. I think this is so important. I mean, it's really tragic to see in the midst of a pandemic that these 10 cities are popping up, and it really is just like a stain on our on our society that that this has happened. And I think from a development perspective, I think that over the years there's been this backlash against condos and this backlash against development. That development is part of this process of gentrification. That it's pushing people out, it's driving up the prices, and it's leading to displacement. And I think we're in a moment where we can now start to re-envision what development actually means and see development as something that adds to communities and creates stronger places and places that don't displace people from them. And I think what Roya described and I think there is an absolute role for government here in terms of the way that policy is made and the way that new condos and new developments are approved, that ensure that in every one of them that we have inclusive zoning, that we ensure that affordability is built into every one of those buildings in terms of the units and in terms of replacing if there's old buildings that are being taken down, replacing the old units, and also replacing the old retail. I mean, it's not just, it's this process of change and this rapid pace of change. I mean, think of something like the Eglinton Crosstown, which is being built, which is now driving huge opportunities for development along the route. But some of that is happening in really important historically Black communities like Little Jamaica at Eglinton and Oakwood and in that area. And again, I think the communities are not saying freeze us in time. What they're saying is we want to be part of the development, and we want our communities to be able to continue to benefit from growth and continue to live and thrive here and have our residents remain and businesses too. And I think this is a real rethinking in the way we're doing development. I think policy has to be part of it. And I think this is where we can reach something that scholars call the collaborative advantage, where working together across disciplinary boundaries, across sectors, we can deliver outcomes that are better than any one party could achieve on their own.
Well said. And Susan, we've got about 30 seconds till we have to wrap the evening. So is there some, it's a big question, but is there something you'd like to add?
I'll echo Maddie's point about policy acceleration. We need it. So we need those policy innovators or disruptors or whatever. And also I'm really loving the strategic philanthropy that companies have now. So it's tied to the social and environmental outcomes of their business as opposed to being separate from it. And it can be used to spur investment. It can also just be used to address some of the issues that we're talking about here and very much linked to the company's business.
Oh, did we lose her? Oh, okay. Okay, I thought we froze for a moment. That's awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Rochelle, Maddie, Susan, Roya. You guys have been wonderful this evening, and I hope everybody enjoyed listening to you as much as I did. You guys are a wealth of information, and we have a lot of work to do. But with people like you guys leading the charge, I'm hopeful. And thank you to everyone who tuned in this evening for Building a Sustainable Toronto, Plans for a Better City by 2030, part of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And I will throw it over now to Milena from the United Nations office here in Toronto.
Thank you very much, Candice. You've been an absolutely incredible host and moderator for tonight's event. We very much enjoyed having you a part of the team. Hi, my name is Milena. I'm a project lead with UNACTO, and I'd like to take a quick moment to say a few words about the team that made all of this possible. So tonight we discussed how to build a strong and resilient city in the midst of an ever-changing environment and the importance of leadership and coming together to move change in the right direction. Now I'd like to acknowledge my fellow team leaders who came together in laying the foundation for this incredible project and building it up to be what we all witnessed tonight, brick by brick. Firstly, I'd like to thank the SDG 11 project team for their hard work from day one. Without your creative minds and dedication, this event would not have been possible. Craig Arnold, Grace Avoci, Milan Petkovic, Nidhi Mehra, Rose Nixon, Sophie Wu, and Vidya Pandya Raju, you're all rock stars. Thank you to the UNACTO media and communications teams for your resilience and diligence in bringing this project to life. To UNACTO President Irene Kalszewski and Vice President Stacey Benny, thank you for your incredible guidance and mentorship and for pushing this event forwards. I think I can speak for everyone on the UNACTO team when I say your strong and kind leadership has inspired us all. Thank you.
Yay!